All right, well, thank you all for coming. We're going to go ahead and get started. By way of preliminary, if you haven't figured it out yet, there are box lunches being provided, and they're over there if you're wondering where they're coming from. So I'm Andy Cullison. I'm the director of the Prindle Institute for Ethics. And in light of recent events at the Prindle Institute, we thought it'd be important to bring anybody together who wanted to talk about some of the recent controversy surrounding the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. So what I'd like to do is sort of talk us through sort of some of the origins of this and how we got to where we are today. And actually, I also want to talk a little bit about some of the fixes that were signed yesterday. So just a kind of outline of what I'd like to do is I'm going to talk about a little bit about the origins of the 93 federal law, and then I want to say a little bit about why states started passing their own laws, and then I want to say a little bit about why people are concerned about the Indiana version of the law, and then I want to say a little bit about some of the fixes, and then I think this is a good opportunity for us to think about a few general questions about tensions between different kinds of rights and freedoms that we sort of come to expect. And what we'll do is I actually want to be very brief. I don't want much of the focus to be on me up here. I'm going to briefly walk us through some of these issues as impartially as I can, and then I'd like to let you at your tables discuss some of the focus questions for a while. And then what we'll do is we'll bring it back together for maybe 10 minutes or so for people just to get up, share their thoughts, talk about what they think about some of the answers to the focus questions, or just really anything that's on your mind about this issue. So that's how we're going to proceed. So in 1990, the Supreme Court ruled against a Native American who was fired for having traces of drugs in his system. And this went all the way, he disputed this, it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and his claim was, look, the drugs were in my system because it was peyote, and I was using peyote as part of a religious ceremony. So it's kind of weird that the government would infringe on my religious rights in this way, and I ought to be protected against that. The Supreme Court ruled against this person, and they said, basically, look, your religious conscience shouldn't trump the law of the land. If it's a law that's generally applicable, it applies to everyone, you shouldn't be able to just opt out of it because you have some religious objection to the law. That's a rough sketch of what their reasoning was. And people got kind of worried about this. They're like, well, that's weird. If we can start passing laws and infringe on the rights of minority religious groups, we have a problem. So in 1993, Chuck Schumer, a Democrat from New York in Congress at the time, introduced this law called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And the idea was, even if it's a law of the land that's generally applicable to everybody, if it's going to be a law that encroaches on someone's religious freedom to practice their faith the way they see fit, the government has a kind of burden. They have to really demonstrate that it's in furtherance of a compelling state interest. And if they don't do that, then the law ought not apply to that person. And at the time, this bill had bipartisan support. And then, later, in 1997, the Supreme Court ruled that this Religious Freedom Act didn't apply to the states. So what happened is a state was going to allegedly encroach on the religious liberty of an individual in that state. I think they wanted to tear down a building. And the person appealed to the Religious Freedom Act. And then the Supreme Court ruled, well, wait a second, the federal government ought not encroach on your religious liberty, and they've got to show some kind of compelling interest. But if the states pass some law and they want to say that you got to stick to the law of the land, even if it violates your religious conscience, that's sort of between you and the state. So one thing that's worth pointing out, a lot of people ask, well, why did Indiana pass this Religious Freedom Act? And people sort of had this kind of conspiracy theory because they were passing the law, and they were asking questions like, aren't people in the state of Indiana covered by the federal law? And the reality is they weren't covered by the federal law if it was the state of Indiana doing the encroaching on freedom. So that's why you see all these states passing this Religious Freedom Act. So that's sort of one of the first important things, like why are these things being passed at all these states? The claim was that it was an overreach of congressional authority to get in the way the states interact with their residents. Okay, so now we come to the passage of the Indiana law. And a lot of people will say, well, what's the big deal? Why is this such a big deal? If you look at the specific language that sort of binds the government in a certain way, it's absolutely identical. It says, a government entity may not substantially burden a person's exercise of religion, or it may substantially burden an exercise of a person's religion, only if it meets these conditions. They've got to demonstrate that it's in furtherance of a compelling state interest, and they've got to go about it in the least restrictive way possible. And if you look at the language in the 93 federal law that sort of outlines what the government can do, and you look at the language in the Indiana state law that outlines what the Indiana state government can do, it's exactly the same. I mean, there's not a comma out of place. So people were sort of looking at the federal law and looking at the Indiana law and saying, who cares? I mean, you know, this was a bill that had bipartisan support back in 1993. We love religious freedom, right? I mean, we're America, so what's the big deal with the Indiana law? So now I want to sort of outline what got people so worried about the Indiana version of the law. And there are some important differences between the sort of what happened in 1993 at the federal level and what happened just recently with the Indiana law. The first is that the 1993 law no longer has bipartisan support. There are a lot of people who have seen what people have tried to use the law to justify and said, whoa, wait, we were thinking about, like, you know, letting people grow beards and letting people participate in these religious practices, but now the law is starting to be used to try and justify interference with other individuals in ways that make us kind of uncomfortable, and so it doesn't quite have the bipartisan support as it once had. Also, at least in some of these states with these religious freedom laws, LGBT individuals are protected as a class. So people often will say, well, look, Illinois right next door has this religious freedom law. Why are we so worried about it in Indiana? And the reality is, in Illinois, you could defend yourself in a way by appealing to your status as a protected class if there was an attempt to discriminate. But those are some differences between what's going on in 93 and now. But what I really want to focus on are these two other differences, because they often get trotted out as important differences, but a lot of the stuff that I've read doesn't quite make it explicit why people might be worried about those differences. So I just want to articulate what those are, get to the focus questions, and then we can all talk amongst ourselves. The first difference is that the Indiana version defines person as a business. And you might think, well, big deal. Why would it matter if person is defined as a business? Well, I'm going to say something about that in just a second. And the second difference is that the Indiana version allows you to appeal to the religious freedom law to defend yourself against a lawsuit brought about by another private citizen. The original federal law was designed so that if the government was going to step in and do something to encroach on your liberty, you could get protection. The Indiana law says, well, here's another thing. If you're being sued by a private party, if another individual wants to sue you because they think you've prima facie violated one of their rights, you can also appeal to this law. And I'm going to say something about why that matters. Okay, so the two core differences, the way businesses get defined and this notion that private party disputes can be adjudicated using this law. Let's talk about the first one, classifying businesses as persons. And I just want to use an analogy just to try and make the point about why you might think about businesses being classified as persons might be worrisome. we have individual rights that we protect in this country. And if you want to be, say, racist in your home, you're allowed to get away with doing that. If people come to your house and knock on the door and ask for assistance, and you only want to help people of one color and not people of another color, you're allowed to do that. But if you go down to, Main Street and open up a shop, you've crossed the boundary from the privacy of your individual life, and you've crossed into a more public arena. You're now doing business in the American economy, and once you make that crossover, you've freely entered into a commerce system. And so people think it's kind of fair to sort of say, well, wait a second, there should be certain restrictions on your conduct. And this is the rationale behind barring discrimination for protected classes like race and religion. If you're going to do business in this economy, the idea is it's no longer a matter of your individual rights. You're participating in this system where we need to think more carefully about what you do and don't do and who you serve and who you don't serve. And so when you look at a law that says there are these individual rights we were protecting for individuals to behave in a certain way in the private sphere of their own life, but then we say now businesses can do it too, we've reached a different kind of category, and we've reached a category where some people think once you've freely entered into the commerce system, it might be okay to place certain kinds of restrictions on you. So to extend something that was designed to protect individual rights to protect the rights of a business that's freely entered into American commerce, that's why people are sort of worried. It's a much, much broader notion of how rights might work. So that's one sort of concern about defining person as business. Another concern about defining person as business is it just brings a lot more money to the table. If your individual rights are at stake, and you want to say the government's encroaching on my individual rights, there has to be, if you're going to get legal representation, you need to find someone to represent you. And you might need to find, say, the ACLU to represent you, or you might need to have a claim to get an enormous amount of money to find a lawyer to represent you on commission. But your options are a little bit more limited. Once you open it up to businesses being able to do this, suddenly you have the business treasure chest of cash to defend itself and raise these kinds of suits or defend itself against these kinds of lawsuits. So it's just much more economically viable to raise these kinds of worries. So that was another one of the worries about extending persons to business. Allowing the RFA as a defense against a claim on another private party is that, as I said before, an injustice need not be brought about by the government. And what you can do is you can now go about if you were going about your business just freely practicing your faith, and then the government put a restriction on you, that's sort of one thing. But if you are going about your business practicing your faith, and you do something to at least allegedly offend another party, and they think you violated them in some way, you now get to defend yourself against a grievance from another individual and say, I get to exercise my religious freedom even if it gets in the way of another individual. And that's a big difference. But here's, I think, one of the real reasons people have been worried about these two differences between the Indiana law and the federal law, is that if you look at the origins of the way both of these clauses worked their way in to religious freedom bills, it's actually really super interesting. In 2013, New Mexico has this religious freedom law. A photographer wanted to not photograph a same-sex wedding. And when the photographer was sued for this, the photographer appealed to New Mexico's Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And one of the things that was in dispute during this was in the courts they were sort of worried, well, wait a minute, you're not really an individual defending your rights, you're sort of a business. That's one thing. And the other thing is the government, the state of New Mexico has not stepped in to encroach on your rights. What's happened is you've offended this other party over here, some private party. They're the ones they're the ones who have a grievance. You're defending yourself against them. The government is in no way a party to this dispute. And so the defense of the photographer's defense was dismissed on those grounds. Look, the government wasn't in any way a part of this, so I'm sorry. You don't get to appeal to our Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Well, this had Arizona actually kind of worried. Arizona already had a Religious Freedom Restoration Act of sorts, and then they started saying, well, wait a second. What New Mexico has just done has sort of weakened the way in which people might do certain things here in Arizona. And so this is the bill. This is the actual copy of the bill in Arizona that was introduced with the amendments. I got this off of Arizona's legislative website. It was introduced by Yarbrough. And if you scroll down, these are their edits too. These are the edits that are on the Arizona legislative website. If you look at the red line on item 5, it changes person to include businesses. That was one thing in response to what was happening in New Mexico. It's one thing at least Yarbrough thought we needed to do. And then if you scroll down to D there, it says a person whose religious exercise is burdened, they can claim a defense, and in blue, the addition, regardless of whether the government is a party to the proceeding. So the idea is the claim is, or the worry is, people thought, well, wait a minute, Arizona looked at what happened in New Mexico, and now we have these two additions. And it seemed clearly introduced, these two new things seemed like they were clearly introduced in response to a suit that happened in New Mexico. And now you see that in the Indiana bill. So really what I'm trying to do, if you want an explanation as to why people are so worried about these two clauses, that like how do these things in any way relate to same-sex discrimination? Same-sex discrimination is nowhere in the bill itself. It's these two clauses and their historical origins in Arizona is what has people sort of worried, okay? And that's what, if you, well, if you look at what just happened yesterday, yes?
Not only do a person business, but you have religious beliefs as a person. Hobby Lobby didn't want to have to provide its employees birth control and abortion services under Obamacare. So the Supreme Court has said, you have a business, the Marriott Corporation,
right,
or the Quality Britain, you have whole religious.
Right. That's a very good point. And in fact, and because the federal law doesn't apply to the states, that's one of the reasons the states need to start thinking about, if they want to model what Hobby Lobby did, they need business defined into the law as well. That's another reason. And the other interesting thing about the Supreme Court decision with Hobby Lobby is they were silent about this private party thing. They sort of didn't want to take a stance on that. And so that's one of the other reasons that states are starting to consider working in this private party thing. That's a very good point. So the Indiana legislature put forward a bill yesterday to amend and clarify the Indiana Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And it actually does explicitly bar providers from failing to provide services on the basis of a wide range of traditionally protected classes. But what's interesting and potentially good about it is it also includes sexual orientation and gender identity, not just sexual orientation, but also gender identity. And it also explicitly bars defenses using the Religious Freedom Act to defend yourself against a private party suit for not providing services on the basis of someone's class in these areas, including sexual orientation and gender identity. So it looks like we've got this religious freedom bill that is perhaps designed to preserve what people were thinking about was going to be preserved in the 1993 bill. But it is worth noting a couple of things that might still be a little bit of cause for concern and cause for discussion, and I don't think this discussion is over, in part because of this. It defines provider to exclude churches and religious nonprofits. Now, perhaps you're not worried about churches. Perhaps you think, well, churches, if they want to, on their plot of land, only perform weddings to a particular group of people or something like that, let's let the churches go do that. But religious nonprofits that aren't specifically churches, you might wonder if there's any kind of interesting latitude there to be worried about. And I don't have any views on this particularly. I just think it's not just churches we're talking about that are excluded from the definition of provider. It's religious nonprofits, whatever we want to define that as. Exactly. Hospitals, exactly. Very good point. Yeah. So those kinds of things might be worrisome. And there's actually a whole bunch of stuff going on in Washington right now over this kind of stuff. And the bill itself does not define LGBT individuals as a protected class. Some people were calling for this whole discussion to be an opportunity to have Indiana just regard LGBT individuals as a protected class. The bill doesn't do anything like that. And so, strictly speaking, discrimination on those grounds in a wide range of municipalities in Indiana would still be legal. At least there's no law explicitly prohibiting it. But if you do discriminate on those grounds, you're at least not going to be able to appeal to this bill to defend yourself, is what they're saying. So now I just want to shut up. But I'll leave you with these focus questions. First, I think it's an interesting theoretical question about what are just the requirements of religious freedom. If we're going to protect religious freedom in America, to what extent? What are the boundaries of that? And then a lot of people, at least at the government level, have said it's got something to do with this notion of being a compelling state interest. So there, we just pushed the question back. So what is it to be a compelling state interest? What are the criteria, and roughly, what would be reasonable criteria for the government to encroach or restrict religious freedom? And then I'm more interested in the general theoretical question. Just in general, when you've got two parties, they have deeply held moral beliefs, and we've got to go one way or the other that's going to offend the moral sensibilities of one or the other party. Sort of, what are the ground rules there? How should we go about deciding if you got to offend someone's moral sensibilities? Whose sensibilities are you going to offend? And then this has now, I think, become an issue about protected classes. Protected classes, at least at the federal level, are classes that you can't discriminate and on various grounds. So we allow businesses to discriminate, but for certain groups we say, but you can't discriminate against them. No shoes, no shirt, no service, fine, but you can discriminate. If the class of persons are the shirtless, you're allowed to discriminate against the shirtless. But if the class of citizens is this other class, you're not. And so there's an interesting question about what gets you into the protected class. I think that's a good, interesting theoretical question that's worth our time and attention. So now I will shut up. I will leave us with these focus questions, and then in about 15 minutes we'll come back and have 10 to 15 minutes of a kind of sharing of what people talked about. So thank you for your time. Get a box lunch if you haven't gotten one already, and we'll convene again in 10 to 15 minutes.
I don't know if I'm ready for a question. I was just wondering what the question was. So I guess we talked a lot about the boundary. Where's the private ground end and the public ground begin? How can you define that in law? What is appropriate? So I use an example of. So we felt, I think, at our table, like a pizzeria saying that I'm not going to serve pizza to a certain class is totally inappropriate. That's discriminatory. But then I said, well, where's the boundary? Like maybe someone who wants to rent their loft above their garage, is that now public space? Is that the commerce space? And so what would law need to do to define that private versus public arena? So I don't know. It just seems, it was just wondering what would law need to do there.
I don't want to respond to every comment or question. I want to give most people a maximum amount of time so we can just go around and share.
Rich Cameron. I think one of the things that we talked about was trying to get clearer about the harm involved in turning people away, and so I at least had some perception about the debate around this, that it was hard for some people to grasp what's so bad about if you're turned away from one business, you can just go to another. And so just understanding the sort of basis for claiming that there's a harm here seemed like something that needed to be articulated better, that it's a harm to human dignity not to know if you're going to get served. And that's a fairly deep right that we have. And so getting clear about these. And connecting it to the fact that, yeah, it's not just a one-off sort of instance in a private interaction, but instead it is out there in the public realm. Yeah, and so happening much more systemically. You don't know when it might happen, but it's everywhere.
So along those lines, the way you become a protected class is to be a member of a group that experiences systemic, oppressive discrimination over and over again. So that's why, exactly because it isn't just a one-off thing that happened this time, where the harm from that particular incident might be minimal, it's a pattern. And so groups that are subjected to patterned harassment over time are the groups that we recognize now as protected classes, or we should or might.
Well, this isn't my question, but someone at our table asked, it really got me thinking, because obviously the mix of people in here, we all have our own personal stories and personal attachments to the issue, but the question was asked, why straight people care about this issue, and maybe what events led up to this issue that made us care so much and have such an emotional stock in it. Well, I say us because I'm included in that group, but whether or not you're included, I just thought that was an interesting question, because it got me to think about why we care about these issues.
Well, to answer your question, I just feel like it's for the same reason that white people cared during the civil rights movement. Is because we kind of have this inherent desire for equality for everybody and for everybody to have dignity. And I feel like something on a lot of people's radars just kind of went off when this happened. And so I feel like there's just this inherent feeling that we have when something is not fair, when it's not just. And so we have this internal desire to seek justice out for everybody, not just ourselves. Because inequalities could eventually happen to the majority too. And so it's not just about, if we don't protect the minorities, then in a sense we aren't protecting humanity in general.
So what our discussion was, like, why didn't people care in the past and in past cases along these lines? And I had a response that was, this is a business issue as well. It's economics, and businesses are forced to confront this within the media sphere and within their own private practice. So I think that's one reason why this has blown up so much from just a practical point of view of why this particular issue is so potent. And there's, of course, the humanity comes along with it, but it's also political practicality. Pence was running for president. Everybody wants, the media is going to jump on him, of course. But why this issue has come up so well is because businesses are forced to actually kind of reconcile between where they stand on gay rights issues. And it's really interesting to see that play out, especially within Indianapolis, with businesses stepping forward and making stances of what they feel and how they care about this issue. And it's really, it's become a more cohesive community of people that actually support gay rights.
Yeah, and it's something else that makes me think of is that a lot of people have come around. For me, as an older person, it's kind of incredible to see what happened in terms of what the cultural shift has been around, how many people seem to think that gay marriage is a no-brainer, like, why don't they have it, what is this about? I mean, that's really gratifying and wonderful, and it's a sign of I guess, general cultural change, pushing legal change. In a way. And I think a lot of people were upset about this for really wonderful reasons. I think some of the economic pressure, some of the pressure that was brought to bear against this law was because of corporations realizing that their business was going to be hurt if they didn't get on the bandwagon of, if they offended, gay consumers, right? Or consumers who were supportive of gay rights. And some of those corporations may have been, I don't think a corporation can have a belief, religious or otherwise, but some of those efforts may have been sincere, right? I don't think a corporation's a person. Some of those may have been sincere. Walmart, I don't know, they're not known for their pursuit, for their zealous pursuit of the rights of human beings of any sort, particularly those that work for them. Okay, so that's why I think that the fix is not enough, because I think that's not the only thing that went wrong in Indiana this month, right? We also have someone being sentenced to prison for a crime called feticide, which, you can read more about this, but there's so I guess I want to indicate that this is a political issue as well as an ethical issue, and that there's I'm not sure. I would like to know whether this fix doesn't say anything about the Hobby Lobby, right? And so I'm not against the fix, but there's an incredible amount more stuff that needs to be fixed, having to do both on the legal level, having to do, and the other wonderful thing that happened legally was that it's okay not to pay for school buses for kids to get to school. They're mandated to be in school, but we don't have to help them be there. And so there's like an overall thing here which needs to be addressed politically, in my humble O.
I guess when we're talking about this, whether you're talking about a philosophy of ethics versus how politics are actually applied, I kind of have an issue with the way question 3 is framed, and that's not to Andy at all, but it kind of goes to how government works. I mean, paradigms in this country where you're talking about equality and everything else, everything is always zero sum, and so the framework that we're all led to believe is by extending rights to one, that means there's only so much to go around, so we're going to have to take away from someone else, and that's a framing issue, and that's a framing problem. So the issue that I do have is when it says, what factors should governments consider, it's kind of, one's going to win, one's going to lose, and unfortunately that kind of gets away from the entire, I guess, crux of what it should be is, you either grow the pie or it's all equally distributed, and that in no way, shape, or form takes away from one for the other. One of the big things I found fairly frustrating with the Marriage Equality Act from last year, and also with this too, is some other minority and protected classes feeling incredibly antagonized and upset that, folks are calling this the new civil rights movement, as if any group owns the rights to victimization and things like that. It just seems very counterintuitive to me. So I think the efforts and the fixes to do what we're trying to do to correct these types of actions, the fix is already in, and I don't think it's actually designed to frame it in any other way except for us versus them. And this notion of equality is a great ideal, but unfortunately businesses and just politics in general, there is no great ideal. That is zero sum. And some of these higher level things that we talk about, equality and ethics and these philosophies, those are things that are a little bit more of things that you can idealize and actually actualize on an individual level. But when it's put out into the world of commerce, it's a completely different game that you're playing, and you're trying to shove it into a realm of philosophy and discourse where these things aren't set up to do that. So hence the circular arguments and all that.
Well, thank you all for coming. Glad you could make it out. And students, there are extra box lunches over there. Don't be shy about taking seconds home for leftovers for later. So grab a box before you leave. And thank you all for coming.